Group size. It's probably no surprise that people are more likely to conform to a bigger group. What is surprising, perhaps, is that the effect of group size levels off pretty quickly. Figure 9.5. Research using Ash's paradigm, for example, has shown an increase in conformity as the size of the group increases, but only to a group size of 3 or 4. After that, the amount of conformity levels off. When we consider informational social influence, it makes sense that the larger the number of people who express a particular opinion, the more likely that opinion has merit as a source of information, but only to a certain point. The validity of a consensus opinion increases only if the individual opinions are independent of one another. The more people there are, the less likely it is that their viewpoints are independent. Therefore, additional consenting opinions don't offer any additional real information. Figure 9.5. The effect of group size on conformity. As the number of people in a majority increases, so does the tendency to conform, but only up to a unanimous majority of 3 or 4. After that, conformity levels off. So you can see it's kind of like a scatter plot, but with the dots connected in linear lines. On the x-axis is the number of Confederates, and in the control, and the y-axis is the percentage of errors. So you can see in the control, there's 0 errors, and as you increase the number of Confederates, there's more errors, up to 35%, but it levels off after 4 Confederates. As the number of individuals reporting an incorrect answer increases, conformity increases, but only up to a point. As group size reaches 3 or 4 people, conformity rates level off. It takes a great deal of bravery to stand up to our enemies, but just as much to stand up to our friends. Albus Dumbledore in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. As for normative social influence, it makes sense that the larger the group, the more people one stands to displease, so conformity is more likely. But here too, the impact of group size is seen only up to a point. A person can feel only so much embarrassment, and the difference between being viewed as odd, foolish, or difficult by 2 versus 4 people is psychologically much more powerful than the difference between being viewed that way by, say, 12 versus 14 people. Box 9.2, Not So Fast, Critical Thinking About Conformity and Construal. A common reaction upon learning about Ash's experiment is to think, wow, if people conform that much to a group of strangers, imagine how much they conform to the judgments of those they care about and have to continue to deal with in the future. Indeed, it is true that normative social influence is diminished in situations like Ash's, where people care less about others' judgments because everyone is a stranger and they all assume they'll never see one another again. Yet there are other, more subtle aspects of Ash's procedure that can lead to more conformity than usually occurs in daily life. Participants in Ash's experiment faced a double whammy. First, they had to confront the fact that everyone else saw things differently than they did. Second, they had no basis for understanding why everyone else saw things differently. Could I be mistaken? No, it's as plain as day. Could they be mistaken? I don't see how, because they're not any farther away than I am, and it's so clear. Are they unusual? No, they don't look much different from me or anyone else. If we can pinpoint a reason for why our opinions are different, they don't see things the way I do because they're wearing distorting glasses. Both informational influence and normative social influence are lessened. Informational social influence is reduced because the explanation for the difference of opinion can diminish the group's impact as a source of information. They're biased. Normative social influence is reduced because we can assume that those in the majority are aware of why we differ from them. For instance, if we have different views on some burning political issue of the day, those we disagree with might think we're biased, selfish, or have different values, but at least they won't think we're crazy. In Ash's situation, in contrast, the participants faced the reasonable fear that if they departed from everyone else's judgment, their behavior would look truly bizarre, and everyone would think they were nuts. The broader lesson here is about the importance of construal, even in the context of experiments. As we have stressed throughout this book, people respond not to the objective situations they face, but to their subjective interpretations of those situations. Participants in Ash's study were in a situation in which it was unusually hard to develop a compelling interpretation of what was going on. It's hard to act independently and decisively when things have stopped making sense, so it may be a mistake to assume that ASH's participants would conform even more outside the psychology lab. To understand the real meaning of any experiment, it's important to pay attention to how the participants might have interpreted the instructions, procedures, and stimuli they faced. The same is true for experimenters. They must pay attention to the meaning the participants are apt to give their experience in the lab in order to design studies that constitute truly informative tests of their hypotheses. Running participants in experiments isn't the same as running rats in mazes. People don't passively record and respond to the surrounding context. They actively construe it and respond to what they've construed. Group unanimity. A striking effect was observed in ASH's original studies when the group was not entirely unanimous. Recall that in the basic paradigm, the participant went along and reported the wrong answer a third of the time. That figure dropped to 5% when the true participant had an ally, that is, when just one other member of the group deviated from the majority, figure 9.6. This effect occurs because the presence of an ally weakens both informational social influence, maybe I'm not crazy after all, and normative social influence. At least I've got someone to stand by me. This effect suggests a powerful tool for protecting independence of thought and action. If you expect to be pressured to conform and want to remain true to your beliefs, bring along an ally. Indeed, an important subtext of ASH's research is just how hard it can be to go it alone. People can stand up to misguided peers, but they usually need some help. Being the lone dissenter can be agonizingly difficult. Note that the other person who breaks the group's unanimity doesn't need to offer the correct answer, just something that departs from the group's answer. Suppose the right answer is the shortest of the 3 lines, and the majority claims it's the longest. If the fellow dissenter states that it's the middle line, it still reduces the rate of conformity even though the participant's own view, that it's the shortest line, hasn't been reinforced. What matters is the break in unanimity. This fact has important implications for free speech. It suggests that we might want to tolerate loathsome and obviously false statements. The Holocaust never happened. The World Trade Center attacks were a government hoax. Not because what is said has any value, but because it liberates other people to make atypical remarks that are of value. The presence of voices, even bizarre or patently wrong-headed voices, that depart from conventional opinion, frees the body politic to speak out and thus can foster productive political discourse. Anonymity. If standing up to a misguided majority is hard, what happens when people can register dissent without calling attention to themselves? In other words, what happens when the response is anonymous? Anonymity eliminates normative social influence and therefore should substantially reduce conformity. Indeed, when the true participants in ASH's paradigm are allowed to write their judgments on a piece of paper, instead of having to say them aloud for the group to hear, conformity drops dramatically. When nobody else is aware of your judgment, there is no need to fear the group's disapproval. This effect highlights an important distinction between the impact of informational and normative social influence. Informational social influence, by guiding how we come to see the issues or stimuli before us, leads to internalization, or the private acceptance of the position advanced by the majority. We don't just mimic a particular response, we adopt the group's perspective. Normative social influence, in contrast, often has a greater impact on public compliance than on private acceptance. That is, to avoid disapproval, we sometimes do or say one thing but continue to believe another. Figure 9.6. The effect of group unanimity on conformity. The tendency for people to go along with a misguided majority drops precipitously once there's a break in the majority, when there is just one other person willing to dissent. Okay, so on the x-axis you see number of trials, and on the y-axis you see percent conformity from 0 to 60%, and then you can see a line when there's unanimous majority. The percent conformity is like between 20 and 40%. It's pretty high. And then when there's one dissenter, the percent conformity is between 0 and 20%. So it's much lower. If there is any principle of the Constitution that more imperatively calls for attachment than any other, it is the principle of free thought, not free thought for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought that we hate. Oliver Wendell Holmes. Internalization, private acceptance of a proposition, orientation, or ideology. Expertise and status. Suppose you were a participant in Ash's experiment, and the other participants who were inexplicitly stating what you thought was the wrong answer were all former Major League batting champions. If you proceeded on the assumption that a player can't lead the league in hitting without exceptional eyesight, you'd probably grant the group considerable authority and go along with the group's opinion. In contrast, if the rest of the group were all wearing thick eyeglasses, you'd be less apt to take their opinions seriously. As this thought experiment illustrates, the expertise and status of the group members powerfully influence the rate of conformity. Expertise and status often go together because we grant greater status to those with expertise, and we often assume, not always correctly, that those with high status are experts. To the extent that these characteristics can be separated, however, expertise primarily affects informational social influence. Experts are more likely to be right, so we take their opinions more seriously as sources of information. Status, in contrast, mainly affects normative social influence. The disapproval of high-status individuals can hurt more than the disapproval of people we care less about. Many researchers have examined the effect of expertise and status on conformity. One of the most intriguing studies of status used a paradigm quite different from Ash's. Torrens, 1955, gave the members of Navy bombing crews, pilot, navigator, and gunner, a number of reasoning problems, such as this horse trading problem. A man bought a horse for $60 and then sold it for $70. He later repurchased the horse for $80 and then, changing his mind yet again, sold it for $90. How much money did he make on his series of transactions? For the correct answer, see page 284. Answer to horse problem on page 282, $20. Amount paid equals $140, $60 plus $80. Amount received equals $160, $70 plus $90. The crew then had to report one answer for the whole group. Torrance monitored the group's deliberations and found that if the pilot, who generally held the highest status, originally came up with the correct solution, the group eventually reported it as their answer 91% of the time. If the navigator offered the correct answer, the group ended up recording the correct answer 80% of the time. But if the lowly gunner offered the correct answer, the group offered it up only 63% of the time. The opinions of higher status individuals thus tend to carry more weight. Expertise, status, and social influence. When the United States was preparing to invade Iraq to unseat Saddam Hussein and secure his putative weapons of mass destruction in March 2003, the government sent Secretary of State Colin Powell to speak to the delegates of the United Nations because he had great credibility. Powell presented the case for the U.S. government's contention that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, hoping to convince the delegates of the need to invade Iraq. Culture. As we emphasize throughout this book, people from interdependent cultures are much more concerned about their relationships with others and about fitting into the broader social context than people from independent cultures. People reared in interdependent cultures are therefore likely to be more susceptible to both informational social influence, they consider the actions and opinions of others very telling, and normative social influence, they consider the high regard of others very important. Thus, people from interdependent cultures might be expected to conform more than those from independent cultures. Evidence supports this contention. An analysis of the results of 133 experiments using the Ash paradigm in 17 countries found that conformity does indeed tend to be greater in interdependent countries. The individualism that is highly valued in American and Western European societies has given individuals in those independent cultures a greater willingness to stand apart from the majority. Tight and loose cultures. Michelle Gelfand and her colleagues have pursued a distinction between cultures that overlaps somewhat with the independence-interdependence dimension, but differs enough that it deserves a name of its own: tightness versus looseness. Conformity to social norms lies at the heart of this construct. Some cultures, which Gelfand calls tight, have strong norms regarding how people should behave and don't tolerate departure from those norms. Other cultures are loose. Their norms aren't as strong, and their members tolerate more deviance. In a highly ambitious study, the Gelfand team examined a number of variables in 33 nations, 2011. They found that compared with loose nations, tight nations are more likely to have governments that are autocratic or dictatorial, to punish dissent, to have sharp controls on what can be said in the media, and to have more laws and higher monitoring to ensure that the laws are obeyed, and to inflict more punishment for disobedience. If a nation was tight on one of these dimensions, it tended to be tight on all. If it was loose on one, it tended to be loose on all. Tight countries include India, Germany, People's Republic of China, South Korea, Japan, Austria, Portugal, Britain, Turkey, and Italy. Loose countries include Greece, Hungary, Israel, the Netherlands, Ukraine, New Zealand, and Brazil. You probably guessed that the United States is relatively loose, which it is on the whole, but there's great variation across America's 50 states on almost everything, including how tight or loose they are. California, Nevada, and Maine are rather loose, whereas Mississippi, Kansas, and Texas are rather tight. Gelfand and her colleagues surveyed people in each of the 33 countries, asking them about the appropriateness of arguing, crying, laughing, singing, flirting, reading a newspaper, and several other behaviors in each of 15 different social situations or places, such as a doctor's office, a restaurant, and a movie theater. The tighter the nation's laws and norms, the fewer behaviors were allowed in these various situations. The researchers also asked people if their country had many social norms, whether others would strongly disapprove if someone acted inappropriately, and so forth. Citizens in tighter nations pointed to tighter constraints. Tight versus loose cultures. A. As this picture of Chinese girls lined up for school illustrates, some cultures are relatively tight. They have strong norms about how people should behave and tolerate very little leeway in deviating from those norms. B. Other cultures are relatively loose. Their norms aren't as stringent as this more chaotic line indicates. Why are some nations tight and some loose? The Gelfand team found that tighter nations tend to have higher population densities, fewer natural resources, unreliable food supplies, less access to safe water, greater risk of natural disasters, more territorial threats from neighbors, and a higher prevalence of pathogens. It appears, then, that behavioral constraints are associated with, and perhaps partly caused by, ecological constraints. Gender. If there are cultural differences in conformity behavior, should we expect gender differences as well? Perhaps. There are significant differences in how various cultures socialize boys and girls, but they have one thing in common. They all sex type to some degree. Women are raised to value interdependence and to nurture important social relationships more than men are, whereas men are raised to value autonomy and independence more than women are. So we might expect women to be more subject to social influence and thus to conform more than men do. Reviews of the literature on gender differences in conformity have shown that women tend to conform more than men, but only a bit. The difference in conformity tends to be greatest when the situation involves face-to-face contact, as in Ash's original study. However, the difference also seems to be strongly influenced by the specific content of the issue at hand. As we have seen, people tend to conform when they're confused by the events unfolding around them or the topic under discussion. For instance, if you're like most people, you know more about sandwiches than the periodic table, so you're less likely to conform to other people when they assert that the most important ingredient in a good sandwich is horseradish than when they assert that the atomic number of beryllium is 62. Analyses of the specific contexts in which men and women differ in the tendency to conform reveal just this effect, that you are more likely to conform in areas where you feel less confident. Thus, women tend to conform more in stereotypically male domains, on questions about geography or deer hunting, for instance, whereas men tend to conform more in stereotypically female domains, such as questions about child-rearing or relationship advice. It should be no surprise, then, that overall, women and men tend to differ in conformity, but only slightly. The influence of minority opinion on the majority. There was a time in the United States when people owned slaves, when women weren't allowed to vote, and when children worked long hours for scandalously low pay in unhealthy conditions. But small groups of abolitionists, suffragettes, and child welfare advocates saw things differently than their peers. They worked tirelessly to change public opinion about each of these issues, and they succeeded. In each case, the broader public changed its views, and important legislation was passed. Minority opinion became the majority opinion. One of the most dramatic examples of minority influence in the West is quite recent. Over the past 20 years, the acceptance of same-sex marriage has gone from a small minority to a majority today. Examples like these are reminders that although conformity pressures can be powerful, majority opinion doesn't always prevail. It's possible to resist conformity pressure, and minority voices are sometimes loud enough to change the prevailing norms. How do minority opinions come to influence the majority? Are the sources of influence the same as those that majorities bring to bear on minorities? In the first experimental examination of these questions, Serge Moscovici and his colleagues had groups of participants call it whether a color was green or blue. 1969. The border between blue and green isn't always clear, but the critical stimuli the participants saw were ones that, when tested alone, participants nearly always thought were blue, 99% of the time. The experimenter showed participants these stimuli in a setting in which they could hear one another's responses, including those of a minority group of respondents, Confederates of the study, who all responded alike. When the Confederates varied their responses randomly between green and blue, the participants said green after the Confederates did so only 1% of the time, about the same as when participants responded alone. But when the Confederates responded with green consistently, the participants responded with green 8% of the time. The influence of the consistent minority showed up in other ways as well. When the participants thought the study was over, the experimenter introduced them to a second investigator. This second investigator showed participants a series of blue-green colors and recorded where each participant individually thought blue left off and green began. Those who had earlier been exposed to a consistent minority now identified more of these stimuli as green. Their sense of the border between blue and green had shifted. Thus, when the minority opinion was consistent, it had both a direct effect on participants' responses in the public setting and a latent effect on their subsequent private judgments. Give me a firm place to stand and I will move the world. Archimedes of Syracuse. Further investigations of minority influence have shown that minorities have their effect primarily through informational social influence rather than through normative social influence. People in the majority are typically not terribly concerned about the social costs of stating their opinion out loud. They have the majority on their side, and normative social influence is minimized. But they might wonder why the minority keeps stating its divergent opinion. This can lead the majority to consider the stimulus more carefully, resulting in a level of scrutiny and systematic thought that can produce genuine change in attitudes and beliefs. Thus, majorities typically elicit more conformity, but it is often of the public compliance sort. In contrast, minorities typically influence fewer people, but the nature of the influence is often deeper and results in true private attitude change. Minority influence on the majority. Minority opinions can influence the majority through consistent and clear messages that persuade the majority to systematically examine and reevaluate its opinions. A. British suffragette Emmeline Pankhurst presented her views in favor of women's right to vote to an American crowd in 1918. B. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat at the front of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, in December 1955. Her actions resulted in a citywide bus boycott that eventually led the U.S. Supreme Court to declare that segregation was illegal on the city bus system. C. Harvey Milk was the first openly gay person to be elected to public office in California. His activism contributed to the much greater support for the civil rights of gay and lesbian individuals that we see today. Looking back, conformity can be a response to implicit or explicit social pressure, and it can be the result of automatic mimicry, informational social influence, or normative social influence. Group size influences conformity, but it appears to reach maximum effect at around 4 people. Unanimity is also crucial in conformity, and a single ally can help an individual hold out against the group. People conform more to those with higher status or expertise, and they conform more when they must express their opinions publicly rather than register them in private. People from interdependent cultures conform more than people from independent cultures, and women conform slightly more than men. Conformity pressures notwithstanding, minorities often make an impact, primarily through informational social influence.